In 1981, the United States Department of Defense released what they claimed to be was the first comprehensive list of U.S. nuclear weapons accidents. Included on that list were several accidents that had not been reported to the public at the time that they occurred, some of which had never been reported prior to the report in 1981. And among those was a previously completely unacknowledged accident that occurred in December of 1964 near the tiny town of Vale, South Dakota. That time when the warhead fell off of a Minuteman missile reminds us of how important it is to use the right tool for the job. It is history that deserves to be remembered.
A U.S. National Park Service history of the Minuteman missile, published on the webpage of the Minuteman Missile National Historic Site, cites the October 1957 Soviet launch of Sputnik as the event that drove the development of the Minuteman missile. Following Sputnik, the website notes, one headline proclaimed, "U.S. must catch up with Reds, or we're dead." The issue was not the 23-inch diameter sphere that produced a small radio beep, per se, but the Park Service explains the huge Soviet rocket that hurled the satellite into space. The Soviets had first demonstrated a thermonuclear device in October of 1951. The launch of Sputnik represented more than a touchdown in the game called the space race. It represented the Soviet ability to deliver a thermonuclear weapon anywhere in the world. Thus, the Park Service explains, at the urging of his military advisors and under tremendous public pressure, President Dwight D. Eisenhower reluctantly accelerated America's ICBM program. In 1958, Congress increased the appropriation for Minuteman from $50 to $140 million. The following year, Congress added $2 billion to the Minuteman budget, to be spread out over the next 5 years. One particular issue was that the existing U.S. programs to develop an intercontinental ballistic missile, the Atlas and Titan programs, were liquid-fueled. Such missiles could not be safely stored with the fuel in the missile and would require that they be manually fueled before launch. This meant not only taking much longer to launch, but also the cost of large teams to maintain and operate the missile. The Wall Street Journal noted at the time, the missiles were not a push-button affair, but will require a highly trained crew, several times as large as the largest bombing crew. What the United States needed, the journal concluded, was a second-generation missile that could use solid rocket fuel. While the concept made sense in theory, there were many technological barriers to overcome. In 1956, the job of overcoming those barriers was given to a 42-year-old Air Force colonel and chemical engineer named Edward Hall. A 2006 obituary in the New York Times said of Hall, as hundreds of millions of dollars were poured into a cash program to jumpstart the American effort, Colonel Hall emerged as a technical leader, particularly in the rush to develop rockets using solid, not liquid, fuel. Hall and his team were able to solve the most difficult technical issues within a year, earning him the sobriquet, father of the Minuteman ICBM. The Minuteman was introduced into the United States Strategic Arsenal in 1962, and an improved Minuteman 1B version became operational in 1963. The National Park Service explains that the first solid-fueled intercontinental ballistic missile the U.S. Air Force would deploy, the Minuteman could stand dormant and unmanned for days, weeks, months, and decades on end, needing only limited maintenance and upkeep. Remotely controlled from underground launch control centers miles away from the silos, it offered a hair-trigger launch response. From the time keys were turned to execute a positive launch command until the missile left the silo, only took about 1 minute. Hence the name, Minuteman. Designed to be produced in large numbers that could be dispersed over a large area to make them difficult to target, the missiles were deployed at several bases, including Ellsworth Air Force Base, near Rapid City, South Dakota, with the 44th Strategic Missile Wing, the Black Hills Bandits. In keeping with the rapid pace of the entire project, silos and launch facilities were installed surprisingly quickly. The National Park Service notes that by early summer of 1963, the steel fabrication was finished at all 165 South Dakota sites, and crews were completing the silos at the rate of 1 per day. Those 165 sites included 150 silos containing the Minuteman 1B missile. The Minuteman 1B was 55 feet, 11 inches long, weighed approximately 65,000 pounds, had an operational range of 5,500 miles, and carried a single 600-pound W-56 thermonuclear warhead with a yield of 1.2 megatons, or the equivalent of 1.2 million tons of TNT, mounted in a Mark 11 reentry vehicle, or RV. Traveling at some 15,000 miles an hour, each missile could deliver a warhead from the United States to the Soviet Union in half an hour. By 1964, the 44th 150 Minutemen were in their silos and on strategic alert. But in December of 1964, the system was still relatively new. Retired Senior Master Sergeant Alonzo Hall told South Dakota Public Broadcasting last year, "In 1964, I think they were still going through the growing pains of trying to figure out who was going to take care of what systems. So, General Radio Repair Technician, that sounds like a group of folks that could take care of the security system." On December 5th, the crew of a launch control facility codenamed Lima 1 reported a fault in the inner zone security system at a launch facility, that is a missile silo, codenamed Lima 2. The Rapid City Journal explained in 2017. Lima 2 was one of 150 steel and concrete silos that had been planted underground and filled with Minuteman missiles during the previous several years in western South Dakota, where the missiles were scattered across 13,500 square miles. Lima 2 was near the tiny unincorporated town of Vale, north of Sturgis and east of Belle Fourche. A narrative of events written by the Air Force in 1964, but not released until 2017 after the newspaper The Rapid City Journal issued a Freedom of Information Act request, explains that at 1200 hours Mountain Standard Time, a team of two 44th Missile Wing communication repairmen was dispatched to Lima 2 to troubleshoot the system and rectify the discrepancy. The two technicians first had to remove the silo access hatch and, after ruling out other faults, proceeded to the equipment room, which circles the upper part of the silo, to test a relay called K1, located in the security alarm control box. The report explains the procedure. The airmen were using the ARL technique of checking the relay. That is, fuse F1, also located in the control box, was removed from the circuit momentarily and then reinstalled. A good relay clicks audibly when the fuse makes contact in its holder. The problem is that the airman, whose name has been redacted from official reports, lacked an important tool, a specifically designed fuse puller. Instead, the report notes, the airman, lacking a fuse puller, utilized a screwdriver to pry one end of the fuse from its clip. But there was a problem. Reinserting the fuse, the airman was unsure whether there was a click. He tried again, but was still unsure. He then tried a third time. The report reads, he again pulled the one end of the fuse away from the clip and then pushed it back to make the contact. At 1500 hours, Mountain Standard Time, simultaneously with the making of this contact, a loud explosion occurred in the launch tube. Buddy Smith, a retired Air Force technician, told the Rapid City Journal, "I wasn't there, but I know there were two technicians who ruined their underwear. 'Cause that ain't supposed to happen." At the same time, the report writes, the missile status indicator launcher panel in the Launch Control Center indicated a fault and a warhead alarm. Unsure exactly what had happened, the report notes that the airmen expeditiously evacuated to the soft support building, where they immediately established contact with the missile combat crew at the launch control facility. Hall explained to South Dakota Public Broadcasting, since they used a screwdriver, the drawer has capacitors which store power. So when they put the screwdriver in there and they lifted that fuse, they made contact with the case. And that power went directly from the capacitor in the drawer to the chassis, straight through the ground, and caused the retro rocket to fire. Calling the accident a personnel error, the report explains, a maintenance technician inadvertently shorted A+ battery potential to ground this application of plus battery voltage, coupled with the fault in the retro cable connector, provided a path for sufficient current to flow and ignite the retro rocket. The Rapid City Journal explains that the retro rockets were housed below the cone of the missile. They were supposed to fire when the missile was in outer space to separate the third and final fuel stage from the cone, allowing the cone and its warhead, which were collectively called the re-entry vehicle, to fall towards the target. The report writes, it was subsequently determined that the explosion, a re-entry vehicle retro rocket firing, had caused the re-entry vehicle to separate at the ball lock interface of the spacer assembly and topple approximately 75 feet to the floor of the launch tube.
That is to say, the 5-foot-tall, 3-foot-in-diameter cone that included the 1.2 megaton thermonuclear warhead fell off the missile and down the space between the missile and the silo. The report dryly noted, the technician did not use the authorized, available tool to remove the fuse.
Ruined underwear aside, the journal notes that the immediate accident could have been much worse had the short circuit gone to the missile rather than the retro rockets. Retired technician Bob Dirksing told the paper, it would have been a completely different story. I'm sure that there would have been fatalities. The boys who were down there would have been fried. The Air Force declared a broken arrow, a code meaning an accident involving a nuclear weapon. The silo was cordoned off and a team sent to assess the situation. A radiation monitoring team found no alarming radiation levels. The Rapid City Journal writes, by about 10 p.m., the scramble to assess the situation was over. Nobody was injured. The missile was slightly damaged, but otherwise intact. The warhead was safe inside its cone, although the cone was damaged. And, important to the Air Force, the journal continues, except for some Vale area residents who probably saw the commotion and wondered what was going on, the public knew nothing. Reporting on newly released documents, 9 News of New South Wales, Australia wrote last August, no release concerning this incident was made to the press. The entire operation was handled in such a way that the nearby communities were not aware and did not exhibit even a mild interest in the operation.
The Rapid City Journal noted the next step. The emergency was over. It was time to plan a salvage operation. Sometime before midnight at Ellsworth, the phone rang for Bob Hicks.
Just 20 years old, Robert Hicks was a nuclear weapons specialist of a Minuteman missile maintenance team. The University of Arkansas Press explains that at the time, Hicks was the first nuclear weapons specialist of any missile maintenance team to be awarded a highly qualified rating from the 3901st Strategic Missile Evaluation Squadron, which evaluated each missile wing on an annual basis. When the chief of the maintenance missile team called him, Hicks told the Rapid City Journal, he said, the warhead is no longer on top of the missile. The paper notes, that was enough to cause me to get dressed pretty quickly, Hicks recalled. Taking a specially designed truck used for carrying warheads in 20-degree weather, Hicks and another airman were in such a hurry to reach the scene that the truck was pulled over by a South Dakota highway patrolman. Hicks recalled that the officer said, y'all seem to be in a hurry, but Hicks, of course, couldn't tell him why. The University of Arkansas Press writes that the trooper commented that it was late for a trip to the missile fields. Hicks told him that they traveled whenever the need dictated. The trooper didn't ask further questions and wished safe travels to the team. When they arrived, Hicks notes that there were around a dozen people at the scene. The journal writes, as we later joked, Hicks recalled in his slight Texas drawl, they were standing around not knowing whether to scratch their watch or wind their butts. Hicks installed a work cage, a device that could be used to inspect the entire missile, and accompanied an explosive ordnance technician who wasn't trained to operate the cage into the silo. As they descended in the cage, Hicks used a socket on a long metal pole to install igniter safety pins, which would break the electrical connections between the stages, rendering the missile safe or unable to launch. The University of Arkansas Press writes that when they got to the bottom of the launch tube, they found the reentry vehicle lying horizontally against the launch tube wall on the floor. The brief 1981 acknowledgement of the accident reported that when the RV struck the bottom of the silo, the arming/fusing attitude control subsystem containing the batteries was torn loose, thus removing all source of power from the RV, but also noted that the RV structure received considerable damage. While Hicks and the EOD technician determined that there was no immediate risk, the press writes that the damage was sufficient to prevent the standard reentry vehicle handling equipment to be used for recovery. In the end, it was Hicks that suggested the solution, using a cargo net with sufficient weight capacity to lift the cone from the silo. While the suggestion of a 20-year-old airman was at first written off by the senior officer at the scene, who told Hicks, "Airman, when I want an opinion from you, I'll ask you." After discussion, he was asked to explain the idea more thoroughly. The process was painstaking, taking nearly 2 hours to lift the warhead the 75 feet out of the silo. And Hicks, the only one qualified to drive the special truck, drove the damaged missile cone back to the base. Air and Space Forces magazine noted in 2017. In March of 1965, the base newspaper quietly named Hicks as the Maintenance Man of the Month for his division, without reference to the accident. Soon after, he received an Air Force Commendation Medal for his courageous actions. While some recommendations in the report that was released in 2017 have been redacted, 2 were left unclassified. The existing retro-rocket circuitry does not provide enough protection against short circuits, and the present method of testing the K1 relay by removing the F1 fuse is unsafe. Despite the successful recovery of the missile, there was yet one more twist. In 2022, another report compiled by nuclear research organization the Sandia Corporation in 1965 was acquired by the Rapid City Journal in response to a Freedom of Information Act request. This report criticized the Air Force for going it alone to recover the warhead without consulting the agencies that had designed it, warning that after this accident, the warhead was in such a condition that an improper recovery procedure could have had serious consequences. If not actually leading to a detonation, an improper procedure could have perhaps placed the nuclear system in a more critical state.
In all, the Air Force estimated that the accident cost some $1.85 million in 2017 dollars. By 1973, the Minuteman I missiles had been replaced by the more capable Minuteman II missile, which themselves were all decommissioned by the end of 1995. But today, 450 Minuteman III missiles remain in the U.S. nuclear arsenal, but none of those are in South Dakota. The last of the Minuteman missiles in South Dakota, Minuteman IIs, were decommissioned in April of 1994, and the 44th Missile Wing was deactivated the following July. In 2017, Popular Mechanics noted that the missile where the accident occurred today sits empty, and the property is now the home of a honey extracting business. Perhaps what is most surprising about the entire incident is that there was no public acknowledgement of the accident at all until 17 years after it occurred. And important information, including that the nuclear agency had determined that the Air Force increased the risk in their salvage operation, were withheld from the public for 57 years. Perhaps the United States Air Force hoped that the 1964 Minuteman missile accident near Vale, South Dakota would become forgotten history. Recently, I took a trip to go meet my new baby granddaughter. And on the way, something very strange happened. Our plane had been pushed back and was waiting to get in line to go to the runway when another plane rolled by, and the wash from its jet engines kicked up a rock and shattered our plane's windshield. You know, I've flown commercial airliners a lot, and I faced a lot of reasons for travel delays, but that was certainly a new one on me. But it did remind me of another instance where the wash from a jet engine caused an accident with much more severe implications than a mere travel delay. The December 8th, 1964 fatal runway accident of a B-58 bomber at Bunker Hill Air Force Base in Peru, Indiana, deserves to be remembered.
The Indianapolis Star wrote on December 13, 2018, "Most people know nothing about Indiana's nuclear bomb incident," said Tom Kelly, a retired police officer who volunteers at the Grissom Air Museum. The term broken arrow has become recognized as a U.S. military term for an incident involving a nuclear weapon, popularized in the 1996 film of the same name. Actually, the U.S. military uses numerous terms to refer to various incidents involving our nuclear arsenal, and the term broken arrow, supposedly used as a code to streamline communications and speed incident response, is neither ubiquitous in the U.S. military nor is it a global nor international code. In fact, the official terminology used by the United States Department of Defense is accident involving nuclear weapons. Maybe not as arcane as broken arrow, but still frustratingly vague. The term encompasses events with varying severity, from an accidental or unauthorized launching, firing, or use by U.S. forces or U.S.-supported allied forces of a nuclear-capable weapon system which could create the risk of an outbreak of war, to public hazard, actual or implied. In fact, there has never been an accidental detonation of a U.S. nuclear weapon, but there have been, according to AtomicArchive.com, 32 accidents involving nuclear weapons in the U.S. arsenal.
I think it's safe to say that any accident involving a nuclear weapon represents a public hazard, real or implied, at least to some degree, but it represents a risk also to our service members, who face the dangerous job of being the tip of the spear of the American nuclear deterrent.
The Convair B-58 Hustler was America's first supersonic heavy bomber. The aviation magazine Hush Kit said of the B-58, "Fast, accurate, and survivable, the Convair B-58 Hustler was a sexy Cold War totem. Its glamour belied the grimness of its intended role as a strategic nuclear bomber." Intended to replace the subsonic Boeing 47 Stratojet, the Hustler was a radical design, described by the website Hot Cars as one of the maddest bombers ever built. B-58 crew member Jack Strank was quoted in the Indianapolis Star. "It just felt different. Everything, even the sound, was different. The speed, the responsiveness. It went like an arrow, but it was steady like a brick. It was like God in heaven." Another crew member quoted in the Star described flying the Hustler as like riding a rocket. It's easy to see why the plane has become iconic among aviation enthusiasts as well as its crews. Colonel George Holt Jr., who served as a B-58 Navigator Bombardier, told Hush Kit, "I was quite amazed at my first sight of a B-58. This baby looked fantastic. It was much bigger than I'd imagined, and you could tell it was built for speed with those 4 brute-forced J-79 engines strung beneath its delta wing. With a sharply tapered needle nose, It looked ready to break the sound barrier while still on the ground. This racehorse was itching to get out of the stable and run with the wind. But all that performance meant a particular strain on the crew. The Indianapolis Star wrote in 2018, a needle-nosed delta wing job, 96 feet long. The gleaming silver Hustler was wondrous to look at, but it was not easy to fly. Hustler crews were highly skilled and highly respected. Among Cold War-era aviators, they were the next thing to astronauts. B-58 Hustlers cruised at Mach 2. The crew were quite crowded. Holt explained that the B-58 was the only bomber aircraft I know of that had a single pilot with 2 navigators on board. The DSO was a rated navigator. The crew sat in tandem, one behind the other, in 3 isolated cockpits. No standing room available. Perhaps luckily for the cramped crews, flying the Air Force's first supersonic bomber required all your attention. Holt continued. People often ask, did you become claustrophobic sitting in such a confined space for hours on end? My reply was always, no, I was just too darn busy during the mission to have any time to think about being claustrophobic. One interesting difference from previous bombers, the B-58 cockpit had a seat ejection system, Holt noted. I had some hesitation as we headed out to the aircraft. Something didn't feel right. I had my helmet and oxygen mask and my nav kit, but something was missing. My shoulders felt light. Then I realized I didn't have a parachute. After 10 years of flying in tactical and strategic bombers wearing a fairly heavy parachute for hours on end, I suddenly realized those days were over. No parachute required in the Hustler. The escape capsule had its own installed parachute. So this would be shirt-sleeve flying. The B-58, serial number 60-116, was part of the 305th Bombardment Wing. Only 2 bomb wings of the Strategic Air Command were equipped with the B-58. The 43rd Bombardment Wing, originally stationed at Carswell Air Force Base near Fort Worth, and the 305th, stationed at Bunker Hill Air Force Base in Peru, Indiana. The 305th had previously operated the B-47, and the first of the Air Force's new fast B-58s arrived at the base in May 1961. Crews of the 305th demonstrated the capabilities of the new bomber. In October 1961, a B-58 of the wing completed Operation Greased Lightning, setting a world speed record for a nonstop flight from Tokyo to London that still stands today. The Kokomo, Indiana Tribune noted in 1963 that for their efforts, the crew received words of personal praise from the late President Kennedy and the Distinguished Flying Cross. The B-58 broke a lot of records. On May 10, 1961, one of the planes stationed at Carswell, nicknamed Firefly, flew a sustained speed of 1,302 miles per hour for 30 minutes. That feat earned the Blériot Trophy, an award that had been established in France in 1930 that had set the once-thought nearly impossible requirement of flying at least 1,243 miles per hour for 30 minutes. The crew was sent to France to receive the award at the Paris Air Show, while another crew flew Firefly there. On the trip, Firefly set another record for the fastest Atlantic crossing to Paris, with an average airspeed of 1,105 miles per hour. The crowds at the Paris Air Show cheered as the plane landed. The Fort Worth Star-Telegram wrote on May 27th, record-breaking B-58 hit at a Paris air show. But the plane that was notoriously difficult to operate showed another side as well. On June 3rd, the original crew that had earned the Blériot Trophy did a flyby over the air show. The Star-Telegram reported the next day. An estimated 60,000 spectators in the stands saw the Hustler fly over, make 2 slow rolls, and disappear into the overcast. The plane, which 8 days before had streaked across the Atlantic in a record 3 hours, 20 minutes, crashed northeast of Paris. Dead were Major Elmer E. Murphy, age 36, pilot, Major Eugene S. Moses, age 40, navigator, and First Lieutenant David F. Dickerson, age 27, defensive system operator. The Paris crash of Firefly was, the Star-Telegram noted, the 8th B-58 to be lost since the plane went into production. It was perhaps the necessary price of being on the cutting edge. General Dynamics executive Frank W. Davis told the Star-Telegram that the crashes, regrettable as they were, have not been excessively numerous considering the pioneering nature of B-58 flights. The crews of the 305th also experienced the risks of operating in the B-58. The Lafayette, Indiana Journal and Courier wrote on August 27, 1963, fire that broke out in a B-58 jet bomber during a landing that has been described as routine burned 3 officers at Bunker Hill Air Force Base Monday night. A witness outside the base said the plane bounced as it landed and skidded down the runway on the west side of the base, catching fire. He said flames shot 75 to 100 feet in the air. By the 30th, the Courier and Journal reported that 23-year-old weapons system officer Captain William Bergdahl had died from his injuries, and that Navigator Major William Barry was in critical condition, with burns over 90% of his body. Barry died the following day. The terrible accident left an impression on Air Force Captain Manuel Rocky Cervantes. An article written by Cervantes' daughter and published on the website of the Grissom Air Museum said, as they left the base hospital after the accident, Rocky promised Captain Jack Strank that he would never die that way. But notably, all these accidents had occurred without nuclear weapons on board. Nuclear weapons were not typically carried on training missions, but the B-58 was built as a nuclear bomber. Its fuselage, too small to carry an internal bomb load, the B-58 carried a single-main nuclear armament on a centerline pod and two tandem subpylons under each wing root, each of which could carry smaller, intermediate-yield tactical thermonuclear gravity bombs, thus carrying 5 nuclear devices per plane. While tests were conducted to fit the plane for conventional armament, the B-58 was more expensive to operate than other Air Force bombers, and so was never used to carry conventional bombs.
That is to say that an accident involving a B-58 that was carrying its intended payload would be much more likely to create a public hazard.
December 8th, 1964 was a very cold and snowy day at Bunker Hill Air Force Base.
The Grissom Museum explains, with the blowing snow limiting visibility on the runway, a KC-135 declared an in-flight emergency and asked for permission to land at the base. Bunker Hill was a Strategic Air Command installation and home to half of the supersonic nuclear strike fleet, the B-58 Hustler. Command ordinarily discouraged intruders for security reasons, but this pilot said that he was in trouble. He wasn't. This kind of subterfuge was fairly common during a SAC Operational Readiness Inspection, or ORI. The inspection team would come up with some way to sneak onto a base and then wreak havoc for a week while inspectors tested every squadron under wartime conditions. Just minutes after landing, the SAC Inspector General was escorted to the command post, where he presented Colonel Carleton with an execution order for a simulated emergency war plan mission. Before they could retaliate against a Soviet first strike, the aircraft would have to escape the base ahead of an attack. Planners estimated that the defense's early warning system might give the air crews 15 minutes' notice. The clock started ticking the moment Colonel Carleton received his orders. The drill was intended to test readiness. How fast could planes get in the air? But these were planes that were on full alert status.
That is, unlike the accident that had killed 2 officers the previous August, these bombers were loaded with nuclear weapons.
In the case of the B-58, on which Rocky Cervantes was the navigator, along with pilot Captain Leary Johnson and defensive system operator Captain Roger Hall, that meant 4 B-43 nuclear bombs with a yield of 70 kilotons each, and 1 B-53 high-yield nuclear weapon with a yield of 9 megatons, a massive bomb with a yield 7.5 times that of the largest nuclear weapon in the U.S. arsenal today. Pantheos explains, each time an alert was issued, the crews did not know until they were airborne whether they were on a training mission or in fact an actual military strike. As each plane taxied onto runway 22, they lined up behind one another for quick takeoff, a mere 8 seconds apart in a formation called minimum interval takeoff by the Strategic Air Command. Taking off in a B-58 was an experience in itself. Holt reminisced, I always remember the takeoff and climb out of my first mission. We were sitting on the runway with 4 engines in full afterburner. Then at brake release, I felt pushed back in my seat and we made a rapid roll-off to lift off, and then a climb of 425 knots until we reached altitude. Of course, after takeoff, we had to throttle back out of the afterburner to prevent this racehorse from running wild. The official Department of Defense report explains what happened to aircraft 60-116 that day. As one B-58 reached a position directly behind the aircraft on the runway ahead of it, the aircraft ahead brought advanced power. As a result of the combination of the jet blast from the aircraft ahead, the icy runway surface conditions, and the power applied to the aircraft while attempting to turn onto the runway, control was lost, and the aircraft slid off the left-hand side of the taxiway. The left main landing gear passed over a flush-mounted taxiway light fixture, and 10 feet further along in its travel grazed the left edge of a concrete light base. 10 feet further, the left main landing gear struck a concrete electrical manhole box, and the aircraft caught on fire. The Grissom Air Museum website writes, Johnson would later testify that he saw a flash and the airplane lurched to the left. Then Hall looked out his small window over the left wing and saw flames. The whole thing was on fire, and Johnson ordered his crew to abandon the aircraft. 3 overhead hatches blew off simultaneously.
Johnson climbed out of the cockpit and over the windshield. The heat was intense, and flames licked at his clothing as he crawled across the nose of his aircraft and then jumped down into the snow. Hall likewise climbed out of the top of the burning fuselage and ran across the right wing before diving into a snowdrift. Rescuers rolled him in the snow to put out his burning clothes. Although not seriously burned, he dislocated his shoulder in the fall. Rocky had nowhere to go. Witnesses saw him rise briefly like he was standing up in a seat to look outside. What he saw might have resembled the gates of hell. The Hustler was loaded with 14,000 gallons of military-grade jet fuel, and most of it was burning around the airplane. His position was forward of the wing, so he had nowhere to run. Cervantes was out of options and made a difficult choice. The Indy Star writes, Rocky opened his canopy, stood up, and looked around, said Jack Strank, who was on the base that day and learned what happened from eyewitnesses. By then, the whole thing was engulfed by flame, so he closed the canopy and ejected. He's just thinking, get out of that flame, and this was the only way out. Grissom Air Museum writes of the ejection system, it was very effective at high speeds and high altitude, but completely unsafe for a runway ejection, because the parachute would not have time to open. The Star explains, Cervantes, enclosed in an escape pod, surrounded by fire, ejected. He was shot in the air 100 feet. The parachute had no time to fill. The pod came down hard on the tarmac. Cervantes died quickly. Meanwhile, the plane, with its nuclear weapons, burned. Pantheos writes, meanwhile, firefighting and emergency response crews were trying to put out the fireball and secure the nuclear weapons on board, which were now engulfed in flames. This is where the fail-safe efforts of the Pentagon saved north-central Indiana from a much greater catastrophe. The detonators were routinely kept separate from the nuclear bombs to avoid an unintended nuclear explosion. Firefighters had difficulty extinguishing the flames on at least one of the bombs during this emergency and had resort to digging a pit in the frozen ground, placing the bomb in the hole and covering it with sand to put out the flames. Grissom Air Museum writes, General Everett Holstrom led the investigation and later reported, the high explosives in all 5 weapons detonated. The aircraft and weapons wreckage burned for 2 hours. During recovery operations the next day, the secondary of one of the nuclear weapons burst into flames. It was extinguished, but then it happened again. The next day, when this secondary was moved, it ignited again and was buried in sand. Despite the accident involving what Pantheos describes as nuclear bombs intended for the Soviet Union, not north-central Indiana, the press was surprisingly silent. A brief 3 paragraphs on the bottom of page 13 of the New York Times on December 9 said, Colonel Paul Carleton, base commander, emphasized that there was no danger of a nuclear explosion or of radioactivity. The Indy Star noted, ironically, in 2018, the Air Force and the press played down the incident. An Air Force spokesman acknowledged for the first time that there were nuclear bombs in Indiana, but he insisted on the term nuclear device. He said there was nothing to worry about. 5 nuclear bombs engulfed in a roaring 12-hour fire was a news story for just 2 days. To this day, the Air Force is opaque on the accident, as this redacted copy of a document from the National Nuclear Safety Administration provided last fall to the website governmentaddict.org shows.
Certainly we can take some comfort in the fact that U.S. nuclear safeguards were strong enough that these nuclear weapons didn't detonate even in the face of such extreme circumstances, but the Air Force wasn't quite straightforward when they claimed that there was no threat from radiation. While the destroyed nuclear bombs were taken to disposal facilities, something was left behind. More than 20 years after the accident, Bunker Hill Air Force Base, which in 1968 was renamed Grissom Air Force Base after deceased astronaut Gus Grissom, and today is an Air Reserve Base, was downsizing, and parts of the base had to be remediated, cleaned up for public sale. And it was then that they found, off in the woods, behind a fence and some rusting signs, the buried wreck of B-58 serial number 60-116. Radiation was found both at the site of the original accident and at the place where the wreck was buried, required further remediation.
Despite, or perhaps because of its pioneering nature, the B-58 had a brief shelf life. It was expensive, dangerous to fly. Some 22% of those produced were lost to accident, and despite its speed, quickly became vulnerable to developments in anti-aircraft missiles. The B-58 fleet was retired in January 1970, just 10 years after it had been introduced. A total of 116 were produced.
29-year-old Air Force Captain Manuel Rocky Cervantes left behind his wife, Virginia, 2 sons, Manuel, age 6, and Michael, age 5, and a daughter, Shemaine, who was just 6 months old when her father died. He was one of 17 B-58 crew members who died in the just 8 years that B-58s were operated at the Bunker Hill Grissom Air Force Base. Sometimes that term, Cold War, belies the fact that there were very real casualties. "1965 was a momentous year in American history. The United States started bombing North Vietnam with Operation Rolling Thunder, and U.S. combat troops arrived in country for the first time, starting a new phase in the Vietnam War. The United States invaded the Dominican Republic. Malcolm X was assassinated, and Mariner 4 passed by Mars. But one of the biggest stories of 1965 went unreported in the news. In fact, it was kept secret for decades. Perhaps the single most dangerous U.S. military nuclear accident in history. The December 5th, 1965 A-4 Philippine Sea incident deserves to be remembered. By 1965, the United States had more than 30,000 nuclear weapons, a number that would peak in 1966 before declining. Since the bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, the bombs have never been used in warfare, but they were constantly ready for use at a moment's notice. Among the safeguards put into place to avoid the potential for a devastating nuclear accident in this massive arsenal was the formation of the Atomic Energy Commission, which in the first years after World War II kept control of the actual nuclear material in the hands of civilians instead of the military. Use of nuclear weapons in conflict in Korea was, according to Truman, always on the table, although it required presidential authorization. Numerous figures suggested their use either in certain situations or to discourage Chinese intervention in the war. Douglas MacArthur, commander of the UN forces engaged in Korea, asked for discretion to use nuclear weapons in the event of retreat. When the Joint Chiefs questioned MacArthur about the use of nuclear weapons in the event of Soviet or Chinese escalation, MacArthur provided a list of hypothetical targets that would require the use of 34 atomic weapons. Ultimately, disagreements regarding strategy and insubordination in the form of comments to the press would lead Truman to relieve MacArthur in a still controversial decision. In a speech outlining his decision on April 13, 1951, Truman explained, "I believe that we must try to limit the war to Korea to prevent a third world war. A number of events have made it evident that General MacArthur did not agree with that policy." No nuclear weapons were ultimately used in the fighting in Korea, but the United States remained at high alert during the 1950s and 60s as part of the American strategy to maintain a threat of mutually assured destruction. From 1960 to 1968, a large part of the strategy involved Operation Chrome Dome, in which American planes with armed nuclear weapons would remain in flight at all times, a significant shift from the initial plan to keep nuclear material separate from actual weapons and the subject of another episode of The History Guy. This change in policy was a reaction to developments by the Soviet Union. In 1949, just 4 years after the U.S. first tested the nuclear weapon in the Trinity test, Soviet scientists detonated their first nuclear weapon. American experts were surprised by how fast the Soviets were catching up to American nuclear technology. The same year, the reach of communism grew significantly with the formation of the People's Republic of China, which seemed to further threaten American interests. Air Force General Curtis LeMay, in charge of the American Strategic Air Command, pressed for greater access to nuclear weapons, so they would be available in case rapid nuclear response was necessary. The development of intercontinental ballistic missiles also required all nuclear weapons to be armed and easily ready for potential use. The dangers of this kind of nuclear proliferation became quickly apparent. In February 1950, a Convair B-36 crashed in British Columbia while on a simulated bombing run. Not revealed to the public at the time was that the bomber had been carrying a Mark IV nuclear bomb. It was the first broken arrow incident, an incident in which a nuclear weapon is accidentally launched, detonated, or lost. The bomb has still not been recovered to this day. As in Korea, the United States intended to keep their options open in the growing conflict in Vietnam, a war which quickly came to represent the battle between communism and democracy abroad. During the war, large numbers of nuclear weapons were moved to stations in the Pacific, such as Guam, Okinawa, the Philippines, and Taiwan. By mid-1963, the U.S. had around 2,400 nuclear weapons in their onshore stockpile in the Pacific. But these were not the only weapons deployed in the region. In addition to missiles and planes, numerous nuclear weapons were stored on ships. In 1965, more than 10% of the total nuclear stockpile was at sea. More nuclear weapons in the entire current U.S. stockpile, including aboard aircraft carriers.
Numerous Navy planes were capable of launching nuclear weapons, including the Grumman A-6 Intruder, the LTV A-7 Corsair II, the McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom II, and the Douglas A-4 Skyhawk. Introduced in 1956, the Douglas A-4 Skyhawk was a delta-winged, light attack aircraft capable of carrying the B-43 nuclear bomb, developed in 1956 by Los Alamos National Laboratories to be carried by both heavy bombers and smaller fighter-bomber aircraft. The B-43 was a variable-yield thermonuclear weapon, which had two variants, with 5 yield options between 70 kilotons and 1 megaton. For the relatively small, subsonic A-4 Skyhawk, dropping the bomb would have been dangerous for the crew, so the bombs were sometimes equipped with parachutes to slow the descent and give the pilots a chance to escape. The plane was also equipped with a thermal shield that could be used to block the blinding light from the actual detonation. The aircraft carrier USS Ticonderoga was an Essex-class carrier built during World War II. She was originally commissioned in 1944 and recommissioned 10 years later in 1954. The Ticonderoga had been involved in the Gulf of Tonkin incident, sending aircraft to defend a U.S. destroyer attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats on August 2, 1964. The incident led directly to the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which allowed President Lyndon Johnson to intervene in Southeast Asia. In March of 1965, the first American ground troops landed in South Vietnam. The Ticonderoga was overhauled at the beginning of 1965, but returned to the Pacific near the end of the year, arriving at Dixie Station on November 5th. Her first tour in Vietnam lasted 6 months, and planes from the carrier launched more than 10,000 combat sorties. As with all American aircraft carriers and many other surface ships in the period, she carried nuclear weapons, which could be ready at a moment's notice. According to declassified documents, American carriers often carried as many as 100 nuclear weapons at any one time. American strategists were especially concerned about a possibility of military intervention from China, as they had been in Korea. The carriers were a major part of the American plan for potential nuclear war. In December of 1965, the Ticonderoga was en route to the port at Yokosuka, Japan, for maintenance and rest. According to Chief Petty Officer Delbert Mitchell, an aviation ordnance man on board the ship, on Sunday, December 5th, Captain Robert Miller authorized a crew cut, a training exercise that involved loading a nuclear weapon. The plan was to load an A-4E Skyhawk with a B-43 nuclear bomb. The plane would be loaded on the port catapult, but not launch. It would then be brought back below decks. Mitchell and his loading crew assembled in Hangar Bay No. 2 around 1:30 in the afternoon. At 2 o'clock, the bomb arrived, covered with a gray tarp and escorted by 2 armed Marines. Mitchell told the Naval History magazine, "The W Division personnel removed the tarp from the weapon, and we all immediately identified it as a live B-43 thermonuclear weapon. We were flabbergasted by what we saw. On the side of the weapon was the symbol Y1, meaning that it had a 1 megaton yield. That meant that the bomb had an explosive yield of about 1 million tons of TNT. By comparison, Fat Man, the bomb dropped on Nagasaki in 1945, had a yield of only 21,000 tons. Each member of the crew had a checklist, and Mitchell's job was to verify that the weapon was unsafe and report it to the crew chief. The bomb was tucked underneath the Skyhawk and hydraulically lifted into place on the plane's bomb rack. Once it was in place, the ordnance crew's job was done until the plane returned. 24-year-old Lieutenant Junior Grade Douglas Webster was assigned to fly. Webster had flown 17 sorties into Vietnam at that point, as part of the VA-56 Skyhawk Squadron, nicknamed the Champions. After checking the plane, Webster entered the cockpit. Next, plane handlers pushed the plane onto the No. 2 plane elevator, where it would be raised to the flight deck. The elevator sat at the edge of the deck, with one side open to the sea. A low safety rail was in place, along with a net meant to catch anyone who slipped from the elevator. The plane was pushed with the rear of the plane facing the open side of the elevator and had to be pushed over a lip between the elevator and the deck. But around the same time, the carrier made a slight turn and the deck leaned towards the ocean. Suddenly, Mitchell recalls, the plane directors began to blow their whistles frantically while crossing their fist, directing the pilot to set his brakes. But the Skyhawk kept rolling. Webster appeared oblivious and was looking down even as the crew ran towards the rolling plane. One of the plane handlers managed to throw a chalk under one of the plane's tires, which caused the plane to pivot to the right as the port main gear mount hit the netting on the aircraft elevator. This caused the main mount to break through the steel netting, and the Skyhawk lifted itself and fell inverted into the ocean. As the rear wheels rolled off, the bottom of the plane slammed against the deck. In the book Brotherhood of Doom, James Little, another witness, says he saw Webster's face in the instant before it fell. I'll never forget the startled look on his face. Well, this happened in a matter of seconds, but it was as if it was happening in slow motion. The plane pushers, Marines, and all of us stood there in stunned shock. Mitchell said, "We never saw Lieutenant Webster after he climbed into the cockpit or what efforts he might have attempted to get out of the Skyhawk, but we were stunned to witness a plane, pilot, and nuclear weapon fall." Upside down, the landing gear stuck out of the water as the plane sank. Despite their shock, efforts to recover Lieutenant Webster were immediately made. The carrier came to a stop, dispatching a helicopter to recover the pilot, but he didn't come up. Two nearby destroyers, the Gridley and the Turner Joy, were called in to search the area, and a whaleboat and crew was launched. The only sign of the accident that could be found was Webster's helmet, which, according to Mitchell, he hadn't been wearing at the time of the accident. With the canopy open, Mitchell says, the force of the Skyhawk hitting the water would have seriously injured him as the canopy closed. It's unlikely, Mitchell thinks, that Webster was able to make much of an effort to escape the doomed craft. Little wrote, "I've often thought of the horror of those final moments of that young pilot's life as he plunged down into the dark depths of the sea, with the sunlight on the surface rapidly disappearing, knowing that he was entombed within his coffin, plummeting to his grave." Little dedicated his book to Lieutenant Webster, who gave his life for his country while ensuring readiness for nuclear war. After searching for several hours, the Navy gave up and returned to their scheduled activities. The deck log of the Ticonderoga mentions the event only briefly. At 14:50, while being rolled from No. 2 hangar bay to No. 2 elevator, A-4E aircraft rolled off the elevator and sank in 2,700 fathoms of water. 2,700 fathoms equates to more than 16,000 feet deep, deeper than where the Titanic lays. In the minutes after the accident, a message was sent from the carrier indicating a Broken Arrow incident. President Johnson was notified, but his itinerary that day suggests he did nothing special following the news. Exactly what went wrong is a matter of speculation. The brakes had been checked just prior to Webster entering the plane and were determined to be in working order. What Webster was looking at in the cockpit is, of course, unknown. It's possible there was some kind of mechanical error that Webster was unable to reach the brakes. Whatever the case, the plane, pilot, and bomb were never recovered. The loss of nuclear weapons was an obvious potential disaster for the U.S. military. The fallout of the loss of 4 nuclear weapons over Palomares, Spain, in 1966 resulted in a PR disaster, with significant political fallout, including banning planes carrying nuclear weapons from Spanish airspace. Knowing the potential political consequences, LeMay had chosen simply to keep this Broken Arrow incident a state secret. In the absence of other witnesses, the Navy and U.S. government chose to cover up the loss of the weapon. The Pentagon only admitted to the accident in 1981, and then saying only that a nuclear weapon had been lost in international waters in 1965. At the time, they did not admit to a location, said only that it occurred 500 miles from land. It wasn't until 1989, 24 years after the incident, that the details of the accident were fully revealed. There were reasons the Pentagon did not want to release the details. A May 10th, 1989 issue of the Miami Herald notes, the U.S. Navy had concealed details of the loss of the bomb for 24 years because it was eager to hide the presence of nuclear weapons aboard vessels waging the Vietnam War, and because of fear of feeding Japan's apprehension of atomic weapons. The accident was only acknowledged when William Arkin, an investigative journalist and former Army intelligence officer, released copies of the ship's log obtained from the National Archives. Arkin expressed shock that at the time these ships were engaged in the Vietnam War, they were armed with nuclear weapons. At a press conference, Arkin lamented, "For 24 years, the U.S. Navy has covered up the most politically sensitive accident that has ever taken place." Perhaps as politically sensitive as the idea that U.S. ships participating in the war in Vietnam were carrying nuclear weapons was the fact that the accident took place only 80 miles from the Japanese Ryukyu Islands. The 1960 Japan-U.S. Security Treaty required prior consultation for the U.S. to carry nuclear weapons into Japan. The incident implied that the Japanese government was looking the other way when U.S. vessels carrying nuclear weapons entered Japanese ports. In fact, Ticonderoga had been heading for Tokyo Bay when the accident occurred. The Miami Herald noted the Japanese, who find nuclear weapons particularly painful because of the World War II bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, reacted with surprise and outrage to revelations that the bomb remained submerged so close to Japanese territory. An op-ed in the Iowa City Press-Citizen was more direct. The Japanese are miffed because, as a matter of polite political hypocrisy, it is pretended that we do not bring atomic weapons into Japanese territories. The event caused an international incident that strained U.S.-Japan relations and a diplomatic inquiry, and Japanese protesters picketed the American embassy in Tokyo. Mitchell told Naval History magazine in 2019, "Sometimes I think back to this incident, and after 54 years, it still haunts me."
Since 1950, the U.S. military has admitted to 36 Broken Arrow events. 6 nuclear weapons lost by the U.S. military have never been recovered. But the 1965 incident is unique. Unlike every other acknowledged Broken Arrow incident, when Lieutenant Webster's plane fell into the Philippine Sea, the weapon aboard was fully armed, including the nuclear pit that is necessary for a detonation. The only active nuclear weapon ever to be lost by the United States. The Navy maintains that the weapon broke up before it reached the ocean bottom, that the bomb parts have decayed, and that there is no threat of a detonation. And amongst it all, there is one more loss that needs to be acknowledged. Lieutenant Douglas Webster's name is not on the Vietnam War Memorial, despite several efforts to have it inscribed there. Michael Rawl, his stepbrother, said, "Doug was a superlative guy. He was decisive and strong-willed, and he had just married a beautiful young woman. He had all the characteristics to be top-notch, a leader, wherever he went, in any field." Chief Petty Officer Mitchell told the Naval Institute Press, "Fair winds and following seas, Lieutenant Junior Grade Douglas Webster. I, for one, have not forgotten you." I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.